wild ride. We've been called names by the president. We've been attacked by some of his supporters, sometimes physically. We'll hear more about that later today. And we've grappled with some incredibly difficult issues of journalism that are foundational to what we do. We've grappled with objectivity. We've talked about what's the appropriate language we should or shouldn't use when we're talking about our national leader. We've talked about whether we should be part of the story or outside of it. And we've talked about why people don't trust us anymore and what we can do about that. Here's the good news. Throughout all of that, and throughout all of this last year, we have seen journalists recommit to their original mission and purpose in a way that I haven't seen in my career. They're reminded why they got into this business in the first place. And they're reminded why we have to remind our readers and our listeners and our viewers the incredible and foundational importance of a free press in a democratic society. You would think that we would be past the need for that discussion, but we're not, and it's great that it's happening now. The other great thing that's happened is that we have seen through this period some of the best work that we have seen in a very long time, including some of it written by the people that you'll see on the stage today. So we're very happy to be here. We're going to try to tackle all of that this afternoon. We've divided these sessions up sort of into three parts. At least that's the way we think about them. There's what just happened over the last year with this discussion. The next discussion is about what is it like to cover this administration right now on the front lines from two people who were there. And then in the afternoon session, we're going to look forward and talk about what can we do better and what needs to change. We're live streaming this on cjr.org and on social media under the hashtag CJR Atlanta, so please feel free to join in the conversation. Finally, I want to thank our partners who have been critical in making this happen for us. The Atlanta Press Club and the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, who have been just fantastic. So that's all from me for now. You'll hear from me later. To kick off the first discussion, focused on the year that changed journalism, I'm going to turn things over to Celeste Headley, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Celeste has worked in public radio for nearly 20 years, hosting shows like The Takeaway, Tell Me More, Talk of the Nation, and Weekend All Things Considered. She just published a book called We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter, which sent chills down my spine because that's what my mother always used to tell me when I was in trouble. We need to talk. But I'll get your book and I can reframe this. She's currently the host of On Second Thought on Georgia Public Broadcasting. Please join me in welcoming Celeste Headley.
Hi there. We have so much to talk about, so I want to introduce our distinguished panel here. At the far end there is Andra Gillespie. She is Associate Professor at the Emory College of Arts and Sciences, and she is completing her forthcoming book called Race and the Obama Administration. Hi, Andra. Also next to her is Jonathan Peters. He's the Press Freedom Scholar at the University of Georgia, also CJR's Press Freedom Correspondent, and he's blogged on free expression for the Harvard Law and Policy Review. He's written for Esquire, The Atlantic, Slate, The Nation, many publications. And next to me is Eric Wimple, and I'm sure you've probably read his things as well. He's the media writer for the Washington Post, formerly the editor of the Washington City paper. So let's welcome our panel as well. I want to take us back, since we're talking about how Donald Trump has changed journalism, and some of that occurred before he was president. Fair? Right? So I want to take us back to the campaign, the beginning of the campaign. And let's start with talking about the extra security needed at rallies and how his rallies were very different from those most journalists were used to covering. Eric, do you want to talk about that first?
Sure. I mean, after the campaign had concluded, up at Harvard, they had that always the wrap up, and they had, the CNN guy, Jeff Zucker, they had AP, Kathleen Carroll, and one of the things they all said was that we spent more resources on security than we ever had, and a lot of it related to covering these rallies, which were very frequent and at which Donald Trump would call out specific reporters like Little Katie for Katie Tour, and he would focus the attention of the crowd on the media pen, saying that they weren't doing their job properly. And of course, we all remember, this requires no expertise whatsoever, we all remember they don't cover the whole crowd, they don't do the wide shot. And so there was significant concern among news organizations that people would be assaulted, people would be hassled, and so on and so forth. Put on top of that the anti-Semitic backlash on Twitter, where lots of journalists who covered Trump or who wrote critically of Trump received anti-Semitic threats on Twitter as well as over the phone. And so all of a sudden you see news organizations having rent-a-cops walking around the newsroom, and really beefing up the forces at these rallies, and also doing a hell of a lot of training on how to respond to threats and so on and so forth. So the business of journalism has merged a little bit with the business of private security in ways that it had never done. And it continues to this day, especially, Trump continues to need this jolt that he gets from the rallies. And of course, a staple of these rallies is bashing the media. And for Donald Trump, it can't get too personal. And for his minions, it cannot get too personal. There are so many examples. I'll shut up there, but I could go on.
Well, then, Jonathan, let's talk about what effect that has or has not had on press freedom. I mean, some might say that this could squelch a newsroom's organization. What if they don't have the resources to have the private security? And NPR had training that was similar to sending reporters into a war zone. So how does that affect freedom of the press?
Sure. I think the first observation that I would make, that I made in a column for CJR a few months ago, is that I'm increasingly convinced that, to quote Lord Varys from Game of Thrones, that Donald Trump would be happy to see this country burn as long as he could be king of the ashes. And where better to start the fire than the First Amendment? Why is the First Amendment, do you think, the easy target? Why is that the low-hanging fruit? I think it chums his base. It scores points so far. Many of the people who have parroted the rhetoric that Donald Trump has used have been rewarded for doing so. A few months ago, the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Freedom of the Press Foundation partnered to create a new website called the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. It is an ambitious website. CJR is a partner of it. So are 20-some other press freedom and nonprofit journalism-related organizations. And the ambition of the project is to document nationwide every incident of abuse of a reporter and arrest of reporters for conducting journalism. So far in 2017 alone, we've documented 23 arrests and 25 physical assaults. Of those, the majority have taken place at protest. A half dozen were at the Dakota Access Pipeline Project. A number of others were at the inauguration protest of Trump's inauguration. And most recently, at the Smith-Stockley protest in St. Louis. So, to put a point on this, I think the concern that I have, born from Trump's rhetoric, is the normalizing effect that it has on these types of arrests and abuses of journalists. And, as I can get into a little bit later, we already are seeing state and local government officials parroting the rhetoric that Trump has used.
Greg Gianforte.
That's right. Greg Gianforte is a terrific example. There was a Republican lawmaker in Tennessee who called the local newspaper fake news because it reported accurately a story about his efforts to roll back a traffic cam law because he himself had been convicted under the traffic cam law a number of times. And so these are unfortunately the trends that we're seeing, and I worry about the normalizing effect of the rhetoric.
Then, Andra, let's move on to some of the subject matters which are having to be addressed by major news organizations that possibly have not had to be addressed in this way. And let's start with race, but also gender. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump has made political correspondents who have not had to talk about some issues have to talk about some issues and do creative bleeps to discuss some things, but that also comes up with race. And I would argue that we're having to talk about race in a way that journalists have not really had to address it before, even under the Obama administration. What do you think about that?
So if we go back to 2008, the discourse was about this notion of post-race, that the idea that an African American could successfully run for president was going to tear down one of the highest and hardest glass ceilings.
Did you say post-race?
Post-race. So we were always talking about how America was becoming post-racial, the fact that people could kind of get beyond America's racial history to elect an African-American president was a sign of progress, and it certainly was a sign of progress. What we did not anticipate, and history taught us this, there were people who wrote about this extensively before 2008, was that moments of civil rights progress are often met with backlash, and behold your backlash. This is something that you could see with the emergence of the Tea Party, where there's a lot of empirical evidence that would suggest that some adherents to Tea Party ideologies also espouse racially resentful points of view that are informing their political behaviors and attitudes on specific issues. And then it also manifests itself in the election of Donald Trump, where people were motivated not just by disgust with Washington and anti-elitism and concerns about globalism, but it's also couched in othering. So whether we're othering people abroad or we're othering people here, race is very much at the subtext of this. What's really interesting is that, you think about that day in June 2015 when Donald Trump descends the escalator. It seems like a big publicity stunt. And I think most people assumed on that day that when he starts off by maligning Mexicans, that that's the end of his campaign and that all this is a political
Yeah, but how
stunt.
many times did people say this is the end of his campaign?
Right, and the reason why is that there's empirical evidence prior to this that would suggest that in an America that was becoming increasingly, at least on the surface, racially tolerant, that folks would discount overtly racist messages. And I think what's been so shocking and what somebody like me who's not a journalist but has to study this is trying to figure out is all of the data and all of the evidence that suggested that people would discount overtly racist messages because you don't want to be perceived as racist. How did Trump kind of slip in the middle of all
Okay,
of
so
that?
this brings up another interesting issue, Eric, which is the discussion that has gone on in newsrooms over whether it's okay for us to ever label someone a racist. Right? Is there an objective measure for whether you're a racist? And then also the discussion over other terms, like alt-right, like, many of the things that we have to decide whether we can use them or not.
Right. I mean, I've called Donald Trump a racist in my columns. We have in our opinions column at the Washington Post. Dana Milbank last year did a piece titled "Donald Trump is a bigot and a racist." I believe the facts are there for this deduction, this analysis. I mean, look, media all the time draws analytic conclusions about people. If you support, cutting taxes on the rich and letting the money trickle down from entrepreneurs to lower classes, we might call that person a supply sider, right?
Right.
If Bernie Sanders says we want single payer, we want to nationalize healthcare, we might call Bernie Sanders a socialist.
Right.
If someone says, I want to put a wall up, I want to close the borders, we might call that person an immigration hardliner. If someone says, Obama was born in Kenya, the Central Park 5 needs to be put to death, take your pick, Mexicans are rapists, white supremacists are fine people, we call them the president. I mean, we don't go there. We don't use those labels people won't go there. People, even the mountains of evidence that he's a liar, it's the same thing. Look, mainstream media organizations make their bones off of getting to people close to the president and the president himself. I think it's a tough call.
Yeah.
But I think that, with the case with Jamil Hill,
Jamil Hill is the young ESPN anchor who, in her personal Twitter feed, called the president a racist.
White supremacist.
White supremacist, excuse me.
Yeah,
He has called for her to be fired.
Right. And so I do think that there is just too much evidence out there that Donald Trump is a racist. And, I think that it becomes a question. That doesn't mean you can't be fair to Donald Trump. But I do think that there is something to be said for taking facts and making deductions. And I certainly do, but I'm in the opinions.
Yeah, you're writing a column.
And that's viewed as an opinion.
Right, as opposed to supply side economics. So Jonathan, Eric said the president, he mentioned that he lied at one point, right? So this brings us to the question of fact-checking, which is a unique challenge for journalists. I have never had to make so many decisions about fact-checking, things that are just, I don't know that I've ever had to deal with somebody just blatantly repeating an untruth that is so easily disproven. That's difficult for me as a journalist. And so I wonder, especially when it comes to like our views of not only press freedom, but a journalist's responsibility to the public, the role that we play, how do we grapple with that? What about that has changed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about in the last, I would say, 2 years in my specific area of specialty, First Amendment law, because I've seen so many misstatements made about what the First Amendment does, what it doesn't do, what it is supposed to do, its role in a democratic society. And we've seen for decades now low public understanding of First Amendment rights. And even putting aside the most recent survey to come out on that issue is about 2 weeks ago. It's got some methodological problems to it, but ignoring that when looking at other more sound surveys, the majority of Americans can't name one of the First Amendment rights. And so to the extent that we want to get serious about exercising our rights under the First Amendment, including the right to report critically on the president, the White House, to engage in fact-checking, I think that as a threshold matter, we need to understand the nature of the rights that we are exercising, what they enable us to do, what they don't enable us to do. So if I were to do a national poll, it would show that the right that is most likely to be identified, if I don't give you a list of them, would be the freedom of speech. Freedom of press is somewhere in the middle. Right to petition is all the way at the bottom. Basically, nobody is aware that it exists. And so, when Trump comes out and says something like, I'm going to change the libel laws, and I'm going to make it easier to sue news organizations and win big money, I think we need to fact check him on that, because the president does not have that kind of constitutional authority. This is basic 8th grade civics, whereby most libel law exists at the state level. It is checked by federal constitutional principles enumerated by the First Amendment. And so the president's best way to change First Amendment law, if he wants to do that, including those in the area of libel, would be to appoint judges who share his views of libel and the First Amendment. But otherwise, there is no direct route to doing that.
We're going to take questions at the end, so in about 10 or 15 minutes, if you have a question, we have microphones there, especially since we're live streaming. If you could get to the microphone so everyone can hear you, that would be great. That's fine. We're going to take questions at the end, though. So, Andra, let's move on to another thing that has changed, which relates to pretty much everything that we've been talking about so far, which is how do we take the president's Twitter feed? How are we to cover the Twitter feed, especially so often when people from the White House administration completely discount or go against, contradict what the president says in Twitter? Is that official or is it not official?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a legal issue about this, about whether or not the president's private Twitter account, is going to be archived. And I think at this point, it pretty much has to be archived. But then there's also how presidents communicate directly to the public. And so it was noted 30 years ago in observing Ronald Reagan that Reagan often took to prime time to make public addresses to the nation when Congress was obstructing whatever his legislative plan was. And so he would get on TV, interrupt the 9 p.m. television show and ask you to support a bill that Congress was kind of holding up. And so we call that notion going public. And so it's part of the president's bully pulpit. And we've seen that over time as technology has changed, that presidents use whatever is the current mode of communication to reach directly to the people. It helps to humanize them, it helps to make them seem responsive, and it can be an end run to put extra pressure on Congress to go along with the president's agenda. In that respect, the use of Twitter as a tool to go public is actually, a part of this long tradition of innovation in the United States in technology. I think the issue is the content of the tweets. And whether or not the president is behaving presidentially in making the comments that he makes. And I think for journalists, it's a really hard call when he starts engaging in juvenile and sophomoric behavior, like the NFL tweets, for instance.
Or insulting the leader of another nation.
Right, so there are two questions. So when he's engaging in the sophomoric behavior, should that go to the top of the news cycle? And some people would argue that anything the president does is newsworthy, and so therefore it must be covered. And this is also additional evidence to try to figure out where the president's bigotries and biases are. And then it becomes a question of, is it appropriate for the president to be executing foreign policy via Twitter by, insulting other countries or trying to put pressure on China via Twitter? Is Twitter the right realm to engage in that type of behavior? My personal opinion is no, that you need to use the diplomatic kind of apparatus and that it's there for a reason. But part of the reason why Trump, I think, does this is that he always said that he was coming in to be a change agent. And so he thinks that, well, he's just going to do things differently and he doesn't have to follow norms and customs. And so I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of jazz. And so I'm not saying that people were, that Washington was perfect and that it didn't need to be cleaned up. But there's a difference in coming in and purporting to play jazz when all you know how to play is chopsticks. And that's a lot of what I see here. Like, there's a reason why institutions have evolved and developed the way that they have. There's a reason why there are certain rules and processes and norms. And if you want to improvise and deviate, that's fine, but you got to know the rules first before you can improvise. And I think that's the problem.
I would totally listen to Thelonious Monk play chopsticks, though. So Eric and Jonathan, let's stay with Twitter for just a second because it brings up so many issues. And Jonathan, let me go to you first in talking about the legalities of using that and whether or not, there's actually a whole Twitter feed that then moves every tweet that Donald Trump sends into official White House language that says a statement from the president, right? So what do you think about the legalities of that as an official archive?
Mm-hmm. So the Presidential Records Act makes clear that the president's tweets need to be archived in some way. There's a question about the extent of the archiving right now, how the White House actually, if at all, is doing that.
Because he's deleted tweets.
That's right. He has deleted tweets. He has blocked users. He has specifically blocked users. This was stipulated to this week or last week in a lawsuit that is ongoing, led by the Knight Institute of the First Amendment at Columbia University, that is suing for the claim is that President Trump's Twitter feed is a public forum. Right. And you cannot regulate based on viewpoint in a public forum. Which would mean that when he blocks a user because he dislikes what the user is saying to him, he is engaging in viewpoint-based discrimination of speech, which would be a First Amendment violation. So I think you've got dueling First Amendment banjos here. One is the legal obligation on the part of the White House to archive tweets, even those that are deleted. A deleted tweet, to the extent that he is allowed to delete a tweet, the deletion does not remove the obligation to archive it. And then on the other hand, does the president have the right to block a user because of viewpoint? That's at issue. I would argue no, that would be a First Amendment violation. But
Eric, then how do we make decisions as journalists? Because we have been accused of allowing the president to play us, right? To use inflammatory tweets to distract us from possibly more meaty policy issues. How do we make these decisions on whether to cover a tweet or not cover a tweet?
I laugh because I've heard that the distraction argument is really widespread now. Every time that Trump makes some ridiculous tweet, it's like he's distracting us from the Russian investigation. He's distracting us from climate change. I thought there may have been something about that until the time I was watching on CNN. I always have all the cable channels going all day long.
Oh my God.
I was watching on CNN in the morning. This was back in the campaign. Jason Miller was on television to, I think it was during the transition maybe, to talk up a few of the appointees and how these Trump appointees were so great. And then Chris Cuomo was on there and said, well, the president just tweeted about this other ridiculous thing. What do you have to say about that? And Jason Miller is like, not interested in talking about tweets today. I want to talk about these great appointments that we have for the Trump. But Cuomo said, but what about this ridiculous issue that President Trump just tweeted? I really need you to tell me, whether this reflects his thinking or is just some random thought. Chris, I'd like to stick to the topic I came to talk about today, which is President Trump's great appointees. So like, he outfoxes his own self. So I think that, positing some sort of distractionary theory attributes way too much strategic discipline and calculation to an operation that runs entirely on idiocy. I mean, I don't see how you can stick with that.
And you can fact check that because it's been confirmed that Rex Tillerson called the president a nasty name. So let's take, before we start to take questions, and again, if you have questions, if you would line up at the microphones, we'll take your questions from there. But then before we end this, and since we're talking about how he has changed journalism, we have to grapple with the blurred lines between journalism at this point and politics and entertainment. Here we are in a moment in which one of the more powerful political voices is Jimmy Kimmel. For good or ill, that's the truth. We'll just start with you, Jonathan. We'll just get something from all three of you in terms of how this has or has not changed the basic mission of journalists. Maybe it hasn't. Do you think that what we're seeing here is sort of a sea change?
I don't know that it's changed the basic mission of journalism. I've heard a lot of rhetoric from news executives in the last 6 to 10 months who have said that the mission is clear now, and they've said we feel energized and revitalized. And I guess I would hope that the mission had been clear before because we've been doing this for a while. But to the extent that we are energized and revitalized, I think that's great. And so one, I guess, to the substance of that point about Jimmy Kimmel and getting news and information from Jimmy Kimmel, I found it suspect, the arguments against his credibility on that issue, because we have a president who was a reality TV star. And so you wonder if you use the standard of credibility as entertainer and therefore not worth listening to, then that would put out of the wheelhouse the president, the very person that these people are attempting to defend, using that argument. And then the First Amendment point that I would make to you here is that the First Amendment doesn't much care who you are. It protects the lonely pamphleteer just as much as it does the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at the New York Times or the Washington Post. So it is as much your First Amendment as it is anybody else's.
Great point.
Andra, you want to weigh in here?
So I think I have 3 points to think about here. And if we talk about the blurring of lines, I mean, Trump is more of a manifestation of something that had happened all along. And so I think it's important to think about news organizations as businesses and as corporations and profit, and thinking about how news has been packaged in recent years in order to try to appeal to as broad an audience as possible. And so part of that is a function of us reflecting on ourselves as individual citizens about how we take our knowledge in, about how much news we actually want to consume. Do we want to deal with hard facts? Do we want long, drawn-out stories where we get lots of information, or do we want it in nice sound bites? And so part of this has to do with changing, the news cycle, especially on television, where you've got to fill more hours, so you have more arguing and other kinds of things. But I think we all have to recognize that, one, there's a civics deficit in this country that allows people to not know what their institutions are supposed to do and not supposed to do, that allows them to perhaps be led astray in some instances. And then there is a demand that we place on news organizations as businesses to entertain as well as inform, and that also might actually end up influencing how news is covered. So, I think people are very reflective of the campaign and allowing Donald Trump to get as much earned media as he did, like, showing rallies from start to finish and other types of things. And so I'm sure in 2020 people will rethink that for whoever the candidates are. But, as somebody who confesses to watching a lot of trashy television and trying to figure out how to sort of redeem my trashy TV habits, it's actually been really instructive to understand what reality TV looks like like to help understand the president. And I think sometimes when we think about sort of the divide between the coasts and middle America, it's actually helpful to understand certain things. Like when I look at Donald Trump, knowing that he's a reality television star, I know that it's the villain that always carries the reality TV show. You always tune in for the person that you love to hate. You know, at one point,
Like Omarosa.
like Omarosa, right, on the first season of The Apprentice, or you always tuned in for Nene Leakes or Kenya Moore on the Real Housewives of Atlanta. Like always, the one that causes trouble, the one that stirs the pot, is the one that gets you to tune in. And so while I think that there are some serious problems with President Trump's fixation with media coverage, just knowing that he gets a file of crayons every day just doesn't make any sense to me at all, and nobody should be,
Right.
you know, should be governing their lives that way. You know, I think part of the reason why he is weathering the criticism is because he thinks it's good for business, because on his TV shows, that was good for business.
Right.
All right, so Eric, yeah.
A couple quick points. I love everything that's been said here. Remember, Jimmy Kimmel is an entertainer, but like an entertainer, and this sort of riffs off what Jonathan said, he is capable of propagating an act of journalism. He can marshal facts in support of a position, which is stuff that I and people at opinion sections of newspapers and elsewhere do every day. So there is no, you know, he's not a journalist. He doesn't identify as a journalist, but that doesn't mean he can't do an act of journalism. And I think that that is a wide open area, once again, as Jonathan said. The second point I'd like to make is that people in our country right now do no longer feel that they have the luxury to ignore politics, okay? That is a luxury, and that's not a partisan comment. We felt under Obama, under Bush, under other presidents, a far greater ability to detach from our political system than we do now. And that's simply because, and I don't think that this is really much of a factual stretch, it's a piece of analysis, is that there's madness at the head of our country. There's conflicting opinions and positions that are constantly shifting, and tweets coming out about this and that, and incredibly narcissistic behavior, and people feel unhinged. That's why Jamil Hill felt the need to wade into this stuff. That's why Jimmy Kimmel feels the need to wade into this stuff. Boundaries are collapsing on politics. Politics is invading every part of American life. That's one reason why news organizations that cover politics have perhaps a future now. You know, so that is a couple of things that are happening here. I think it's a great question, just a great question, and you should be credited for that one.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, just one word of warning that we have a lot of smart people in this room. I'm sure you all have incredible, great thoughts and statements to make, but the purpose of this part of the panel is for questions in the form of a question with a question mark at the end. So with that knowledge, please go ahead and give us your questions.
I'll start with a question mark and then give the question. Good afternoon. Thanks for accepting questions. We appreciate that. In putting together this important 5-hour program, did you try to have spokespersons for both the left and the right side of the political agenda? This seems awfully slanted.
This isn't a political discussion. I can answer that one myself. I didn't organize it, although Kyle is here and looks like making his way toward the front with arms crossed. But I could say that this is about journalists mostly for a lot. How many of you in the room are journalists? 4 journalists. Wow. So we're actually talking about our own industry itself and how we're reacting to the political climate and what's changed about us. We're not trying to debate the policies.
Thank you, but my question stands.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, did you want to say something about that?
We did reach out and and weren't able to get everyone we wanted. We do have representatives of the Wall Street Journal here, a representative of the Wall Street Journal, not a left-leaning publication, and of Reuters, which is actually fairly centrist and one of the president's favorite outlets. So your point is well taken. We did make an effort, but I do think we struck a pretty good balance. But you make a good point.
Question.
Yes. First of all, I just want to applaud the efforts that the journalists have made in this past year during this era I applaud you.
Thank you.
Secondly, the question is, given all the things, the outcomes that we've seen during this past election cycle and all the different events that have come up, do you get the sense that we're entering an era where facts just don't matter? Because many of the facts have been very, very clear. And
That's a really good question. Let me get you an. I mean, that in itself is a good question. And Eric, I'm going to start with you. But if either of you want to weigh in on that, do facts not matter?
I have lots of thoughts, but I'd like to hear these folks first.
Jonathan and Andra.
So I'm going to start as the non-journalist on the panel and as a teacher. And to kind of get to your question about balance, especially for somebody like me, there are times when you can figure out what I think or what my background is, but I actually try to be really conscientious about making sure that I present both sides and just try to present an analytical point of view without kind of making opinion. So I don't see my job as being to editorialize. And in the classroom, while professors get a bad rap, and while I know that some of my colleagues, have very strong reasons why they do try to convey their viewpoints, our primary purpose is to teach people how to assimilate information and analyze it. And we know that people are going to sometimes come to different conclusions, but what we want them to do is we want them to understand what evidence is and what it's not, and then how to weigh that evidence appropriately and then use the proper tools to measure it so that they come up with different outlines. And so as a teacher, one of the things that I sort of see as being perhaps problematic in this country is that we don't always teach people how to analyze information. And so there's all kinds of information coming. And we live in a great time where all kinds of things are coming from us, so we can't always discern what's good and what's bad. And so people take the stuff that confirms what they already think. And we have to teach people that there's some sources that never are credible. And there's some sources that will make stuff up, or there's some sources that will make a mistake and then correct it, and there's some that don't do that. You need to be able to discern between those and then draw your own conclusion. But we don't teach people those tools well enough, and so I feel it's my responsibility to at least help contribute to that debate by teaching people how to discern good information from bad information, and then also how to teach people how to interpret information. How to read a poll, how to, look at data, how to understand the difference between correlation and causation. That's
right.
A lot of what I have to do in the classroom.
But and that's great. But when it gets to our job, we find that people don't trust even the facts when we put them before. I mean, our job literally is to go out, find the truth, and then report it, right? And then we trust that whomever our readers or listeners are gonna, take in that information and make their own decisions, whatever that may be. But when you go out and you do your job and you find it, the truth, and then you report it and it's not believed.
Right. Look, the fact checkers have had a field day with Donald Trump. I mean, I forgot what the number was, but by June, the Washington Post had found some 700 or 800 false statements by Donald Trump. Some of them assuredly lies. And those stories, the fact-checking stories, are really, really prolific drivers of traffic. PolitiFact.
They're very popular.
Yes, they're very popular. But with whom? With whom? I think that's the question, and I think that is what gets at the nub of that very, very good question, which is, do facts matter? And I think it depends on whom you're looking at.
And I would just add to that I think facts have to matter if you want to secure and advance press freedom. Because it is a lot easier to target press freedom if you don't see value in the work that the press does. And I think you are less likely to see value in the work that the press does if you've lost confidence in the press. And if the press itself also says, facts don't matter. And so, I think that when you look at the modern legal challenges to the press right now, a survey last year indicated that 53% of U.S. newspaper editors said that the press was no longer prepared to go to court to defend the First Amendment. 27% indicated that they themselves at their own outlets had been unable to bring a lawsuit that they would have liked to have brought. And then a Knight Foundation study from 6 months ago indicated that roughly half of experts in freedom of information law said that they thought FOI principles had gotten worse in the last 4 years, and 90% of them had said that they expected them to get even worse under the Trump administration. So I think that we are facing challenges on all fronts, and I think we would be inviting another major one if we decided that facts didn't matter.
Question.
Hi, I graduated Columbia J School in '72, had a long career, and now I teach journalism at Clark Atlanta University. But after the year that changed journalism, I'm in a quandary. What do we tell students? Do we tell them what we learned, what we did, or is this a whole new era? Where do we go from here for these young people?
You mean to try to make them not run away from journalism?
How to do it?
How to do it. I mean, we can't say alcohol, right?
Yeah. It's a great... One reporter I was talking to a couple weeks said, I can't drink and still cover Donald Trump.
Right.
So, a healthy lifestyle. I suppose that's one way of
That's not something journalists are all that known for.
No, they're not all that known for. But one thing I would say, and I think this session and your leadership of it has been great, and I think the title is right on. But I think that one thing hasn't changed, which is that the core mission and the core job of journalists, which is to report, and then publish your findings to the best of your ability, remains very much a pretty good model. And I would cite, and this is one of the things where Trump has changed journalism and where journalism has remained static at the same time. Washington Post, earlier this year, I forget exactly what story it was, but they were like writing up their stories. You know how these stories used to go. Like, after consulting several sources in the administration, we have concluded this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
And the Washington Post did a story after interviewing 30 sources. Oh my God. In the White House administration and in New Zealand or whatever. That's a little exaggerated. But 30 sources to nail down a story. And one of the reasons this is, and I interviewed Maggie Haberman in the New York Times about this, is that she said, this is February, March, you could talk to one administration official who was telling you what they believed to be the aversion events, and then you talk to another one who's also soberly trying to give you and they're 180 degrees diametrically opposed. So the point is that journalism, its core practices, has never been tested more than it is under this administration. You have to get more sources, more backup, more documentation than ever you have before. And if you screw it up, you are done for. They will put out press releases, the fake news, Breitbart will come out against you. You live a miserable life if you screw up.
Don't tell them that last.
But high stakes, high rewards.
And I'll just say, as somebody who's in contact daily with students, I have a position in the Grady College of Journalism at UGA and an appointment in the School of Law there. I teach 3 days a week. This morning I taught my media law class and then drove over here. So this, I think, goes to the point that Eric made about politics pervading all areas of life and breaking down boundaries. Politics is entering the classroom. I mean, it's been in the classroom for a long time, I guess. It's entering the classroom in a more visible way than it had before. But it's creating cool opportunities for me because students are asking me a lot more questions than they used to about what they're reading in the news. They are more engaged, at least to my eye, than they were in the past. So it's actually created a lot of amazing opportunities to show them where the rubber hits the road. When a student says during our section on libel, what are the powers of the president to change libel law? Or, can the president block Twitter followers for viewpoint-related reasons? And in the more routine journalism classes, news writing, information gathering, media ethics, I'm seeing a ton of energy and interest, and not in a partisan way. It's not the students coming in, saying, let's go get them. It's how in the hell do I do the kind of journalism that the Washington Post does, or that the New York Times does. Last year, so I was on the faculty at the University of Kansas for 3 years before I came to UGA. And you may have some memory of the high school student journalist in Kansas that broke open the massive story in Pittsburgh about their high school principal, the soon-to-be high school principal, who had fabricated a bunch of information on her resume. And they had modeled their reporting after David Fahrenthold. And so, professionals matter. Practice matters. And so I guess I am not worried now. I'm kind of inspired.
I want to get to everybody's questions, and there's a lot of them. Over here, question.
Yes. Hello. Okay.
Hello.
I had a question for Ms. Headley.
That's me.
So, like, I want to ask, do you think journalists are being harshly silenced because of, like, the thoughts of the foremost CBS executive, Haley Geffman?
Do I think journalists are being silenced? I will say that I've never been criticized in the way I have before. I have never been called a race baiter quite as much as I have since this campaign began because I talk about race. It seems that there are some issues that even to discuss them, people call you a partisan, even if you're just trying to report on issues of race or issues of gender. So I will say that, but I don't feel silenced. Part of that is because my leadership at GPB is absolutely committed to a free press and an open press. And I think a lot of that, and I think that's very true at the Washington Post as well, is that a lot of that is going to depend on your leadership and what their editorial principles are and whether they're ready to back you up. Mine is, absolutely. But I'm sure there are other journalists that are not quite so lucky.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Would you comment on Facebook as an outlet for journalism? And Jonathan, particularly, can we expect, should we have more regulation with respect to?
Yeah, so the vast majority of Americans now get their news from Facebook.
True, yes. So to the latter point, should we regulate social media more than we do? I guess I've written 2 law review articles about that in the last year. And the first one was looking at the question, does the First Amendment have any role to play in governing these private actors in the way that they intermediate speech? The major problem here is a constitutional principle. It's a doctrine called the state action doctrine, which says that you enjoy rights under the Bill of Rights against the government and against government actors, not against private actors. So if Facebook makes a decision to block you, to disable your account, do you have any First Amendment recourse against Facebook? No, you don't. So what I did, I looked at a bunch of different conceptions of the state action doctrine, held them up to the light to see if there is any role for the First Amendment to play in this area at all. No matter how you hold it up to the light, one reason or the other, there is no role to play. So then you say, well, could Congress pass a law that would in some way dictate to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, what Rebecca McKinnon, who is an internet scholar, once called the sovereigns of cyberspace? Could you constrain their activities in some way? And the very First Amendment that would not aid us in regulating them actually provides the freedom for those platforms to make choices about the speech that they host, the users who come onto their platforms, and the conditions that they have to satisfy in order to use those platforms.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do you think, real quick one, do you think it's unseemly then for Congress to get in and hammer away at these social platform providers and say, what are you doing here with your ads and so on and so forth? Do you feel that has any chilling effect? Is that abuse of power in your view?
You know, it could, to the extent that you were talking about a government actor that is calling to the floor, calling to the mat a private entity in exercising its First Amendment rights. Now, that does not mean, as a private entity, that you are immune from criticism from private actors, from the government.
Part of the wrinkle here, though, is that there are restrictions on campaign ads. Mm-hmm. And when you have possibly a foreign nation purchasing campaign ads for an American candidate and airing it on social media, doesn't that then take us into a different area of the law?
It could, or you could simply say we can overcome the First Amendment challenge because, if we are talking about political speech in general, that is going to be subject to the highest level of First Amendment scrutiny that we know, which is called strict scrutiny. And in order to overcome that, you have to show a compelling government interest and then show that the regulation you've drafted to serve that interest is as narrowly tailored as possible. So it is not impossible for Congress to regulate in this area. It simply means there's a really high bar Congress would have to get over.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is an interesting question. So we know what consumption patterns are.
I want to get to these last.
But we also want to think about Facebook as a platform versus Facebook as a news organization.
Right, exactly.
Right? And
it is not.
It's not a news organization.
Right.
But a lot of people don't know that because our civics education is bad. And so when something comes on your Facebook feed from Uncle Bob, unless it's Uncle Bob Woodward, you should probably go verify it. Like, and people aren't disciplined enough to do that. So this starts, very young, where you teach people, no, you have to pay attention to real news. No, you can't be cheap. You need a subscription to a newspaper. No, not everybody's opinion is equally weighted. You need to see who's actually done their homework about issues. And no, don't get it off of InfoWars, because that's made up. So,
yes, question.
Hi, so kind of to piggyback off of what you just said, you said that there are some sources that aren't credible. So can you name the sources that aren't credible, and then also name sources that are?
We don't have time for that.
But here are things that you would look out for when you're looking
Right.
for things that aren't credible. One, if it doesn't pass the smell test, go look to see if other people are talking about the same thing, and see whether or not it's coming out on news sources that have been around for a long period of time, like your legacy media.
Yeah.
Second, if you look at websites where it's the same author for everything, don't trust that.
You can start by checking what organization said that a man whose name I won't utter here was actually the Las Vegas gunman and turned out not to be. So you can look at those organizations and start there.
Right. Yes.
Hi. I recently saw a Pew study that said that the trust by the American public in the media is at an all-time low.
Yes.
And credibility.
Correct.
And that, as a journalism professor and a former journalist, this is very disturbing to me, because credibility is our bread and butter.
Right.
I guess to play devil's advocate a little bit, I'm wondering how much of that did we bring upon ourselves by responding to every, and this is just one example, every 140-character tweet by Donald Trump, by sort of making ourselves, even though he invites it, making ourselves the story. I was taught, the old school is you never do that.
Right. I'm going to cut you off there only because we only have 2.5 minutes left.
Thank you.
And talk about whether credibility. And I want to make sure that we're splitting hairs here, because in the Pew study, they did not differentiate between your cable news shows where there's two pundits arguing with each other and, say, a Washington Post column or a New York Times article or a public broadcasting story, right? And I bet you if you polled people on the different types of media that you would get a different story on whether they trust the New York Times and whether they trust cable news. I bet you. But
I'm not sure about that.
But if you look at the Gallup trend on that, they've been asking the same public confidence in news media for years and years. If you look at the Gallup numbers on this, I remember just vaguely mid-'90s, late '90s, the downtrend is pretty steady and goes through Twitter and through Facebook and through everything. So it may be a little bit more precipitous. I would note two things. One, September last year, Donald Trump took credit for the really low, historically low Gallup number. By the way, it's always an all-time low. It's been an all-time low every month for the past 10 years. Number two, I do think Fox News played a little bit of role in this. If you look, Fox News since 1996 has been out on a mission and has gotten a lot of other adherents to just slam the mainstream media every time the mainstream media comes up with a negative story about Republican politicians. And it has been relentless, and it has never stopped. I don't think that's all. I think we do have a responsibility. We do have culpability to some degree, but it's helped. That sagging number is helped on by a lot of factors.
we have 1 minute left, so let's get to one more question.
I was wondering, Eric, has politics, or anybody up there, has politics limited the influence of journalism? You can report the heck out of a story, and still half the country is going to believe you and half is not.
That speaks to the polarization of the United States, which is also at an all-time high, and the fact that confirmation bias prevents people from changing their mind about things that are a deeply held belief. Who wants to handle this one?
You.
Has politics ruined our credibility? I think politics has basically...
Has it limited your influence?
Limited our influence. That would argue that at some point in time, the journalists had a massive influence. And I don't know if that's true, because even if you look back to the Watergate, which many of us would consider to be a high point for journalism, even you look back then, it took people a long time to believe that was true also. But I do think that independent of journalists, the polarization in the United States, which by some measures is as bad as it was since the Civil War, when we were actively killing one another. We're at a point where polarization is journalists almost can do nothing about it. I honestly don't know if there's anything we could do about it, if we have any influence over that. There's so many factors leading into that. I mean, at this point, 88% of Americans would be angry if somebody from the other political party married into their family. And I just am not sure that any story that we do is going to change that.
So, I mean, sadly, we can identify confirmation bias and empirically detect it, at least in political science. We don't talk to communications folks or psychology people, so maybe they've done it and I'm just not aware of the literature. We don't know what the antidote to it is, and we don't know yet how to overcome it. We can identify it
we do have
very
one
well.
wrinkle. Can I just answer that one thing, one glimmer of hope that we have on this, actually, is that the scientists have scuddered. They did a poll in which they asked people, what do you think we should do about the crisis in Ukraine? And and then they asked them where on a map, point to Ukraine. And the worse your geography was, the more far off you were, the more likely you were to recommend military intervention. However, when they told them, okay, now explain to us what exactly the effect of your opinion would have. If we implemented what you think we should do, what would the effects be? For the first time, they saw a crack in confirmation bias. That was the first time they were able to get people to possibly admit that their opinion may be wrong. And it's our first glimmer of light, and it's only because they had to say, okay, if we did what you said, then what would be the result? Wow. So, ta-da!
Thank you. Thank you so much. If the rest of the afternoon goes as well as that went, we're good. So we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with a discussion with two people on the front lines of covering the White House. Now, we have a problem that anybody in this situation loves to have, which is that we have a lot of people. So I'm going to do what happens in church once in a while, where everybody's going to have to move in and take empty seats that are in the middle of the row. You don't have to do it now, but by the time we come back from the break, we need to all be sitting for these empty seats so folks don't have to stand in the back. Thank you very much.
That was great, guys. That was awesome.